Okay, so quick announcements as usual. Homework V1 solutions are available. There's an ICA that is available as well, due before next lecture. Homework C2 is available, and actually the next homework after that is also available. Should have gone available about 1:15 or so. So both of those homeworks are available for those working ahead. Homework C2, 2 questions related to random number generation. They're basically modified versions of book exercises. Be sure to check out the videos and tips that I've posted alongside them. It's due basically in a week from today, but again, it's got that 4-day grace period that's after it. A little bit of book reading, or at least taking a look at these tips here, will be required, as we'll cover the content in lectures E1 and E2, which are after the due date. So I think it overlaps with E1, but this is one of the homework assignments that is pretty plug and chug. It's pretty much the easiest one to kind of pick up this way. I kind of wanted to cram this in because I want to make sure you have time for both practice on homework C2 as well as practice on the D homework D2, before the midterm. So that's the reason why it's a little bit tight here, because you really need access to both random number generation and random variate generation, which are those two. Again, the competition options, I've sort of explained these a bunch of times, but registration for those ends at the end of the month. So if you're interested in those for your final project, then jump on those. So any questions or concerns? Questions online? Okay. All right, so you know, we've been kind of motivating discrete event system simulation, this kind of process-centric view. There's a lot of support for discrete event system simulation in industry. I just posted this kind of example from 2015 in an ORMS, which is a sort of a journal / magazine frequently read in the OR community. And this is an article by James Swain on simulated worlds, where they talk about the breadth of applications of discrete event system simulation models, from parts to patients to vehicles, manufacturing, healthcare, logistics, transportation, military operations, just to name a few, and a large variety of DS simulation packages like FlexSim, and those are all kind of included in that article. So just motivating DES. And so we're going to get into that starting in lab 5 and sort of actually kind of starting with the next lecture D1. But we just want to round out some of those alternatives, and that's what today is for and lab 4 is for. So I'd mentioned this already, that when we talk about computer simulation, there's sort of 3 major groups of simulation frameworks. There's the agent-based modeling, which is kind of the most realistic detail and scaling. It's very, you can get very microscopic. There's, on the other side of it, system dynamics modeling, which I'll talk about here in a second, is kind of the most coarse-grained. It sort of takes out all the variation and just models trends. And then there's what we focus on mostly in this course, this discrete event system simulation, which on this spectrum is kind of in the sort of the most, trying to be very illustrative, in that it has more realism than these kind of trend-based approaches, but doesn't quite have all of the complicating details that we get in agent-based modeling. So examples of what I mean by this is like in system dynamics modeling. So here, again, this is a modeling framework focused on large-scale analysis of trends. It can be very fast. So an example of that is in system dynamics modeling, we usually talk about stocks and flows. So in a graphical simulation framework, we'll draw diagrams like these, where we have a stock, which is our state variables, and a flow, which is effectively the rate of change of the state variables. So whenever you draw something like this in a stock and flow diagram, what you're actually doing is writing a differential equation that looks like this, where you're saying the rate of change of the stock over time is equal to the flow. So in the sim package, you can go into the flow and you can then put an equation which is based on other state variables throughout the sim. And that equation ends up basically allowing you to write the right-hand side of this. And so when you hit run in these simulation packages, what they're really doing is numerically solving a calculus problem. They're numerically integrating a bunch of coupled ordinary differential equations. That's what system dynamics modeling is for. And again, there's no randomness in these differential equations. And so you're really modeling the average behavior of a system. So on average, for example, in this case here, this is ds dt, di dt, and dr dt. These are susceptible, infectious, and recovered components of a population. And so we're not interested in how many people in a population are susceptible to a disease or infectious or recovered at any particular day. We're just sort of saying on average across any epidemic related to this disease, then what would sort of be the average trajectory for this? And so that'd mean across some epidemics, it might be higher, other epidemics might be lower. But if we were to average all of that stuff out, the average trajectory would look like this differential equation. And so you can use ODE methods to solve this coupled differential equation, or you could just draw this thing out, which is what we could do in a system dynamics modeling framework. And this diagram is identical to this coupled differential equation. And so when we talk about system dynamics modeling in SIMS, we're drawing these things out, which behind the scenes are interpreted by the computer as these things and then integrated numerically so that you can end up getting an output for this. So you can see what happens to these three populations over time. So that's what SDM is all about. So it's very average-based, trend-based. On the flip side of that, which you're going to get more experience with in Lab 4, is agent-based modeling, where here we throw the trends out and we try to simulate as many degrees of freedom in our system as kind of we can. We actually want to model every individual, not just groups of individuals together. So I've shown some examples of these earlier, but basically in these modeling frameworks, some of them are a little more cartoony than others, but you're usually explicit about space. So you've got agents, which might be depicted here as the white characters and the black characters. You've got space, which is brown and green. So here, for example, this is a simulation of predator-prey dynamics where the green are the plants that the prey eat. The white, I think, here are the prey. The black, I think, are the predators. And you get the brown are areas where the prey have eaten plants from there, and you have to wait for it to regenerate. So here we actually are trying to keep track of where every individual is, where all the resources are, how quickly the resources replenish themselves. So it's a lot of degrees of freedom here. So we actually have to simulate everything that goes on in every patch of this simulated universe. And so we have this, like I said, so we call these agents, the patches, as well as the entities themselves. We can give them a form of agency, and that's the reason why we refer to them as agents. So instead of talking about just entities like we do in DES, we refer to them as agents because they're entities that actually kind of make up their own mind about what they're doing next. It's not process-based. And so agents have agency. It's very micro scale. There are very few structural assumptions. And so in agent-based modeling, these became very popular as a scientific tool. So in biology, it was actually kind of independently used by biologists and social scientists. In biology, they often refer to it as IBM, or individual-based modeling. Social scientists typically are the ones who use agent-based modeling, and for whatever reason, that is the term that kind of has become a little bit more popular. Biologists were interested in studying complex ecosystem interactions, complex interactions among individuals, things like fish schools and bird flocks, whereas social scientists are interested in complex interactions among individuals, like human individuals, and they even do things like, if you find artifacts, trying to figure out how did those artifacts get there, they often will test out different sort of economies that might have existed in the past and see what are the kind of artifact distributions that come out of the agent-based model. Does that match the artifact distributions we see in the actual real soil? And if they match, then it gives support for that idea that this might be what was going on in this sort of historical society. So engineers often use agent-based modeling to build models of so-called multi-agent systems. So that's another term that we see here. So multi-robot systems, flexible manufacturing systems, These are all systems where we build intelligence into the automation, and then we allow it to interact with other automation systems. And so to test hypothetical combinations of those automation systems, sometimes we need to simulate them. And those simulations often use agent-based modeling tools to simulate these multi-agent systems. So those are three terms you see together: IBM, ABM, and MAS, all very closely related to each other. So you'll see in Lab 4 an introduction to a very popular agent-based modeling tool, both in education and in the sciences, something called NetLogo, which we'll see a little bit more of an introduction to here. There are a wide variety of other agent-based modeling tools used by different communities. So a little more kind of computer science folks use the Repast and Relogo. There's libraries built for Python for agent-based modeling. And then there are commercial programs. And so we in 477, which is our course for system dynamics modeling, that program that they use, AnyLogic, also does agent-based modeling. And so that's another example of other tools that can use that. And there's a wide variety of other agent-based modeling tools that are out there. So, like I said, we mainly focus on DES, but we are going to have this agent-based modeling lab in Lab 4. So I just want to give a brief kind of preview to what you're going to see in Lab 4, so that we're kind of prepared for that sort of thing. So the major differences between the agent-based modeling you'll see in Lab 4 and the discrete event system simulation modeling has to do with time flow. In agent-based modeling, we model every time going, in discrete event system simulation, we typically, we focus on events. So whenever the system state changes, that's where the next clock goes to, as you all know, after doing so many of these hand simulations. In agent-based modeling, we are not interested in events necessarily. We just need some mechanism for moving the time along. So we can do irregular jumps to speed things up, but most of the time in agent-based model works along regular jumps. And so we set a clock. So we say we are going to simulate everything that happens or doesn't happen in the next millisecond of time. And so we will move things along, and it may be that nothing happens in that millisecond. So, but that's the reason why ABMs can be so much slower than DES, because we can waste a lot of time moving from millisecond to millisecond, waiting for something to happen. But it may be that our state variables don't change at all every millisecond. We might have to wait might have to simulate 10 minutes to get a change in state variable. And so that's the reason why they can take a lot longer. But we can simulate much higher resolution, and we don't have to write our logic based on a process where we have to schedule everything ahead of time. So we can get rid of all the logic I'm going to do with figuring out how to schedule things and just let things happen. So basically, if we were going to, for all of what we talked about, primary events and conditional events in discrete event system simulation. In agent-based modeling, generally speaking, everything is a conditional event. We just allow the agents to do their thing, and when agents bump into each other, then we end up having to respond and react to that interaction. So that would be a conditional event. It was unscheduled. It just happened when these two agent positions collided into each other. So agents are concurrent processes. They can alter the environment. They can communicate with each other, and so on and so forth. So usually very spatially explicit, usually very fine-grained, very few structural assumptions about behaviors, very general purpose. And we often can use them to test ideas for coarser grained models. And so in a discrete event system simulation or system dynamics model, we might say, we think on average, this behavior is going to happen. Well, we can actually simulate the microscale dynamics in ABM and see, on average, does that thing happen as much as we're modeling it here? So that's one way we can fit these things together. Now, I'm not trying to just introduce ABMs because I think it's important, and maybe nobody else does. There's another article that I posted on Canvas, again out of OMRS or ORMS today, where it's called The Pedagogy of Zombies by a different set of authors, and it talks about this firm, LMI. It's a consulting firm that was hired by NASA to study how commercial airlines would respond to potential policy scenarios and how airline decisions, affect downstream stakeholders in the industry. And they viewed agent-based modeling as the right way to study this. But the problem that they had is that whenever they would get operations research students in from college or on internships, none of them would have any background in ABM. So LMI created this competition, simulation competition, similar to the competition that I talked about before, to try to encourage undergraduate students to gain more background in agent-based modeling, which they thought was lacking in current IE and OR education. And so their little competition was kind of cute. It's this, I'll show you a picture of it. It's based on a zombie apocalypse idea. And so again, I'll show a picture of it in a second. But the basic idea here is that you are to design models of behavior around a building that has had zombies infiltrate it, and they could compete against whose strategies survive on average. So if you run 100 iterations, so that's like 100 possible ways that zombies could come into the building, then you could say how often did, how many of your simulated humans survived across those 100 iterations, and then compare that to others, and then that's how you could sort of compare these things. And so at first it seems, in this, by the way, I think this competition's still going on. It's co-sponsored now, I think, by Informs and IASC. So it's got actually some, our major professional groups are involved in this too. And so it looks a little bit like this. They did it in NetLogo. So here's a building floor plan, and you may not have access to the floor plan ahead of time when you're designing your behaviors. So you have to drop your behaviors in, and then you can test it on these floor plans. And so you can imagine randomizing the floor plans at the competition, as well as randomizing the entry positions of these zombies. Now, again, it seems a little silly, but I was teaching actually a simulation course, a short course over the summer at another university. And one of the IE students who was there helping us with the short course was a grad student. And he didn't know anything about this competition, but he was building for publication strategies for how people should behave in buildings during active shooter cases. And so, and it was effectively the exact same thing. So, what heuristics should people do? What types of rooms should they go into, and so on. So he had to build behavioral models for how active shooters might move around buildings. And he would have to sort of come up with realistic floor plans. And then he would test empirically how his simulated individuals responded to simulated shooters. Again, it was basically effectively this zombie case. So although, again, it seems a little silly, it actually has sort of real world application. In this case, LMI wasn't interested in that application. LMI just really wanted to get students aware of agent-based modeling so that when they came through the employment pipeline, they didn't have to train them from scratch. So this is one of the reasons why I take the time in Lab 4 to give you guys some exposure to ABM, because it is out there. It's just, for whatever reason, not in the traditional IE simulation curriculum. So hopefully you find it valuable. Now, other examples of this, Southwest is actually a big user of agent-based modeling to investigate its airline strategies. So as one example, cargo management, the bellies of these planes for your consumer airfare often have a lot of empty cargo space. And so what a lot of airlines do is they sell that to basically UPS and FedEx and so on. They basically say, we have no idea how much space will be in this particular plane, but we're going to have unused space. And so if you need to get a package somewhere, then if it makes sense, we'll allow you to load it onto the plane last minute, and then we can take the package where you need to go. So that sounds great, but it's sort of a just-in-time scheduling of when do you get that package onto the plane and what plane do you put it on. It's hard to know ahead of time how much luggage space you're going to have left over here. So they wanted to test a bunch of different strategies. So one of the strategies would be to let the package sit on the ground until you found a plane with room that was going in the right direction. So you need to go from Phoenix to New York, for example, like that. So, and you wait for a plane that's going from Phoenix to New York. Now, there are other strategies you could do there, like you could just put it on any plane, and eventually maybe you would get there. So that'd be kind of a null strategy. You'd think that might be the worst case, but there might be things in between. So another strategy that they simulated in an agent-based model was, what if there is no, the package arrives, and in the next round of planes, there's no plane heading to the destination. In that case, put it on any plane. If there is a plane heading to that destination, put it on that for the destination. And that's the one that their agent-based model showed minimized the latency on these packages. If you think about it, in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense, because there may never be, or there may very rarely be, planes going from some airport, especially small airports, in the direction you want. But there's almost always going to be planes heading to hubs. And from the hubs, they'll go in any direction. So just getting the package into the air increases the probability that it will very quickly be at a hub that will go in the right direction. So it's better that it's waiting in the air rather than waiting on the ground for the rare event of a plane that happens to be going just in the right direction. And that's an insight that they got from actually simulating cargo in an agent-based model. Similarly, when I was growing up, you always boarded from the back of the plane to the front of the plane. And that's how seating, it was just always by row. I'll take these rows and these rows and these rows, and so on and so forth. Now, Southwest, they were one of the first to sort of say, is this the best way for us to load our planes in terms of on-time arrivals and departures, but also in terms of opportunities that we could possibly do here. So Southwest built agent-based models of people boarding planes. And they had to come up with behavioral models of all of the things that people do in the aisles. So they stopped for random amounts of time. It takes a while for them to load their luggage. But while they're doing that, they're blocking everybody behind them, and so on and so forth. And what they found is that although there were some benefits to, say, boarding from back to front, they were almost negligible. So they really didn't make an effect in the long run for actually getting an on-time departure that much at all. So that's when Southwest said, well, what if we monetize the boarding process? So anything we lose in the operations here, we can gain through the money we're going to make by people paying to get on the plane earlier. And so that's where we got some of our modern boarding systems, where now we don't always board from back to front. We have these boarding groups where if you're actually in the boarding group, you realize it's not actually boarding in some order in the plane, and you can always pay to go into a higher boarding group. Well, that's thanks to agent-based models that showed that boarding wasn't that big of a deal. And so that gave the airlines an opportunity to squeeze you for a little bit of money. So these are sort of examples of where it'd be very difficult to sort of come up with these solutions with a purely mathematical model, or purely a DES model, because you kind of need to allow things to sort of flow in a natural way, and agent-based models allow you to do. So any questions about those examples? Just sort of the motivation behind how you, when you're building these ABMs? Okay. So I mentioned this example, so I won't go into it as well, but a couple lectures ago about a group at ASU who published something about studying how the different ways you board planes can lead to the different spreading dynamics for diseases. And they did find that whereas boarding might not actually affect your departure statistics that much, it turns out the different ways you board do affect. If you have one person sick with a disease, then the different ways of boarding actually can affect the probability of everyone else on the plane getting that disease. So it's kind of, other sort of interesting things that you can study with an ABM that be very difficult to study with other frameworks. So that's ABMs. So what I want to give you a quick intro to here is NetLogo, which you'll be using in Lab 4. You'll see a little bit of this in the Lab 4 lectures as well, but I just want to make sure that everybody has at least some background and knows where we're coming from with Lab 4. So NetLogo is it works on all platforms, Linux, Mac, and Windows. It's a Java-based platform. It's a version of Logo, which is a language which was traditionally used in the educational system back, I remember learning Logo when I was like an elementary school kid, so primary school. And it was like when you move a turtle around with a couple of steps or whatever. I don't think it's kind of been abandoned, I think, for education now, but they've added a whole lot of complexity to Logo with a thought that this would be a language that doesn't have any of the baggage of like C or C++ or Java that they could introduce to populations that don't traditionally view themselves as programmers, like social scientists or even life scientists. And that would allow them to still program pretty complex behaviors. It allows agents in real time, it allows humans in real time to interact with the system, modify parameters, investigate, display variables, import, export data into external files, and perform these complex experiments. And it's freely available. It's NSF funded. There's, I think I'll bring up, you can go to the website down here to download it. It also, as of 2015, they have a web version that runs entirely in a web browser. And so this is actually nice for stakeholders because you can put your model online and they don't have to download anything. They just go to a website and they can actually run your model and play with it. They can even modify it to some extent. There's some things that they're limited in doing. They can't save out files or read in files like you can on the desktop version, but there's a lot that they can do. So, and actually in all of the slides in this lecture that show a NetLogo model, if you click on them in the version that's downloadable via Canvas, it will bring you to a web-based version of that model in case you want to investigate it. And this web-based version, because it's based on HTML4, it runs on mobile devices as well. So this is kind of an example of one thing you can do with NetLogo that some colleagues did over in Shesh, which is where they got anthropology and so on, is they combine NetLogo with graphical information systems, GIS. And so this is a whole sort of field of simulation called Abm Gis. And in this case, this was a funded project with NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, where they were interested in knowing how, given so many different ways you can warn people about hurricanes, how do you maximize the probability that people will actually evacuate when they need to? And so they've got, it might be hard to see here, but there's a bunch of little dots, which are population clusters all through Florida. And they've actually have the topography of Florida loaded into this. They have the evacuation routes loaded into this. This is a real map of Florida and where people are located, where the densest areas are and how they get out of Florida if there's a hurricane coming. And then these simulated individuals, they can actually then send to them, tweets or radio messages, different types of, TV. They can send them different types of warnings that people sort of trust in different amounts. Because the thought is if you warn people, and they can do this over multiple hurricanes. And so the idea here is if you warn people, say over the TV about a hurricane and that none of those warnings ever come true, it's like the boy who cried wolf. People stop paying attention to the TV ads. And so how do you optimize over the different ways you can warn people to help it so that you can sort of trickle in, you can kind of the high cost things like the TV, maybe those come a little bit later because you don't want to burn those in case you're wrong. But maybe tweets about the weather you can put out because people don't trust those as much. And so they could optimize across the different ways you could warn these simulated people, and kind of just like that zombies case, over different sort of universes here, you could see how often do people actually evacuate when there's a significant hurricane coming in, how many people don't, how many people get killed, and so on. So that's kind of a combination where you can have these kind of real world structures coupled into these agents and have them move around in the kind of real world. So that's kind of a big contrast to a tool like this one, which is actually preloaded inside NetLogo, where it's testing out some very simplistic ideas about how ants might forage using pheromone trails. So I think I can actually try running that one and see how well this works. So I'll click on that. I'll bring this tab over. So just by clicking on that, it brings up this NetLogo web interface. And I see if I can choose how many ants I want here. So 125. And then if I hit setup, it puts all of the ants at sort of the central location in this central nest. These things out here are food sources. And there's, if I were to hit go, then I will see that these ants randomly forage. And then as they hit a food source, they come back to their nest and they lay a pheromone down on the ground, which evaporates at a particular rate, which I can specify here. So I can specify how they diffuse into the environment and how the chemicals evaporate. And through this, we can see as we adjust these parameters, how effectively are these ants at finding food and concentrating their resources on the food that they find. So if I were to go through here and do things like, well, I'll just make the evaporation super high and maybe the diffusion super low, and we're to reset up this and let it go again, then here we can see there's almost no recruitment. And so whereas before, the first one they found, they concentrated all their efforts on it. And then once they finished with that, then they concentrated efforts on the next one. Once they finish with that, they concentrated efforts on the next one. And here we can see that all three of them are kind of getting, there's no actual recruitment. It's just individuals find it, they bring the food back, and they don't bring anyone with them. So it's a way for us to investigate simple ideas about how these two parameters, which are real parameters out there, can affect the dynamics of how this recruitment strategy could work in a natural system. So it's not, doesn't have any realistic topology, topography. These ants aren't even necessarily moving in a way that real ants do, but hopefully they move in a realistic enough way for us to test hypotheses about how trail laying works. So that's another kind of example of what you can do with these tools. So any questions about this setup here? Either one of those? Okay. So maybe I'll just move this back. All right, so when we look at NetLogo, as you will in Lab 4, you'll see the main things that you can place or interact with on the front panel here are sliders, which you saw me adjusting evaporation rates and things, input buttons like setup and go, switches like this on and off, menus, plots, monitors, commands, and comments. And so these are just different elements of this graphical thing here. It's not whereas Arena, you're going to program things by wiring things together. Programming in NetLogo is not graphical. And so you place these elements that are interaction elements with the human, with the user, but you don't actually wire these things together. You'll actually end up building code which interacts with all of these sorts of things. And so, like I said, this is the kind of the interface here where you can click on this little drop down and then place these things into the space. Now, one of the nice things about NetLogo is once you've got, something like this, if you want to run an experiment, you might want to try a bunch of different evaporation rates or a bunch of different diffusion rates. And it would be a pain to, because this is has random outcomes, to place an evaporation rate and then run this 10 times and then somehow gather some output from it and then do that over and over again. So NetLogo has this thing called behavior space, which you'll play with in Lab 4. And that automates those experiments. And so you'll be able to go into the behavior space and you'll be able to, and it's hard to read on this with the way the projector projects this here, but you can actually specify variables on the interface and ranges that you want it to iterate over. So you can say, try every one of the evaporation rates from 0.05 to 1 in steps of 0.05. And then you can say for each one of those, it'll do the kind of full factorial design. So it's, this is like a design of experiments here where you can specify 10 different things at 10 different levels, and it's going to do each one of the 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 and so on. Each one of those different treatments it will run for as many replications as you want here. So you can set repetitions. And then from each one of those, you can tell it, I want you to gather these data from every simulation run, and specify that here. And I then, once you run this experiment, it'll ask where you want me to put all this data, and it'll dump it out into a spreadsheet. So it can do that without having to actually run the thing. visualize the thing. So it can run these very fast and then dump out data sets, spreadsheets that you can then analyze using Excel. So that's behavior space, which again, you'll get some access to in Lab 4. Now you're also going to see how these programs work. And like I said, in agent-based modeling are entities we call agents, but there are 3 different types of agents in NetLogo. They're the mobile ones, like the ants, which we call turtles, and we can even separate them up into different breeds. There are the stationary ones, like the ants were laying pheromone on the ground. Well, the ground has to remember how much pheromone's been laid on it. So the ground is an agent called a patch. Now, on top of that, and you're not going to see this in the lab, but there's also a type of agent called a link, which I'm kind of showing up here, where you can actually model formal relationships. And so if 2 people are infected, you can create a link from the one who was originally infected to the one who infected them, for example, and you can watch how that network grows, for example. So there's a bunch of different things you can do with links, which just basically give you spatial memory of histories of interactions with people, so or with individuals. There are attributes they're called attributes, just like entity attributes. So turtles, all of them have these attributes by default. They have a unique ID, a breed, a color, a heading, whether they're hidden or not, and then color options. But then you can add your own. So you can say, what's the speed of this turtle? What's the stubbornness of this turtle? How much money does this turtle have? And so on and so forth. Likewise, the patches all have certain attributes with them, basically their coordinates and their colors, but you can add your own. How much pheromone is on this patch? You know, how many times has an agent crossed across this patch? And so on and so forth. So you can set attributes just like you can in a discrete event system simulation. NetLogo's got a models library. So under its file menu, that's where you'll get both of the models that you work on in Lab 4. And that models library has a, if I were to bring up, I could bring up mine, but you'll see in the lab that you just don't have to read all of these, but each one of these ticks are different categories where underneath them, each one of them have as many as 10 to 15 different example models that have already been pre-built for you, from social sciences to earth sciences to life sciences to art, all of them sort of here, a lot of them sourced from the literature. So you've got access to those. There is an info tab in every one of these well-written models, which gives you documentation. So up at the top, when you're looking at the interface, you can go right next to that. And there's this tab that says info. And then on each one of them, there's a tab next to that that says code. It actually shows you the code for each one of these. And the code is written very differently than you might expect if you've used, C or, Java or so on. It's a very different type of semantics, and we'll see that a little bit in a second. So the way you link these elements into the code is you can go up to, like I said, on the ants, there's a setup button and a go button, and you can right click on them, go to their properties, and you can say, whenever somebody hits this button, what procedure do I run? So whenever someone hits the go button, it runs the go procedure. And I check this forever, which basically means run the go, and then immediately after go finishes, run it again. And it'll keep going until I unclick on the go. And that's what kept that ant simulation running. So it basically is running one iteration of the world, and then it hands things back to the sim, which may then run another iteration if the button stays depressed and this is checked here for forever. So what does a go routine look like? Well, so this is the go routine for those ants, and there's not a whole lot that's going on here because NetLogo does so much for you. So you define procedures with to, so you say to go. So how do you go? Well, to go, this is what you do. And then the idea here is rather than setting up like a for loop where you're going to iterate through individuals, you ask all of the individual things. So rather than saying like for I in turtle, min turtle to max turtle, you say ask all of the turtles. So the ask function will use some ordering to ask all of the turtles to do what comes after. So you don't know which turtle it's going to ask first, but it's kind of like a spreadsheet. You don't really care. All you need to know is that it's going to ask all of the turtles to do this logic. And this logic basically says, if if the color is red here, so am I currently carrying food? Then if I'm not carrying food, then I look for food. And so there's a procedure elsewhere where you are randomly looking for food. But if I'm not red, then that means I'm carrying food. So it uses the color of the ant to say whether the ant has food. And then it runs another procedure to return to the nest. And regardless of what it's doing, to make the behavior look a little bit more like an ant, it adds in a random amount of motion noise, wiggle. And so this is basically setting a heading. This is adding a little wiggle noise to that heading, and then it moves forward one. So every ant does that. And with all of the ants doing that simultaneously, you get that ant motion. It asks all of the patches to diffuse the chemical at the given diffusion rate. And that's what's sort of setting up this thing down here. And then it moves the clock ahead by, in this case, the default amount, which is 1, but you can say how many iterations of the simulation represent, time on the clock. So it's a relatively simple language where they've taken a lot of the normal things that you have to worry about when you're programming, like figure out how to schedule who goes before what. All of that's taken away from you, and you just say, well, what do I ideally want to happen? And say, well, at the end of this tick, I want all of the turtles to have done this and all the patches to do that, and I don't care how they do it, kind of like a spreadsheet. That's how the NetLogo works. And so this perspective is the hardest thing about getting used to NetLogo, is this idea of asking, one agent asks another to do things. And you, as an observer, are also viewed as an agent, kind of a godlike agent that's asking other agents to do things. So all agents must be asked to do things. You, as the observer, ask sets of agents to do things. And each agent can modify its own attributes. It cannot modify the attributes of others, but it can ask other agents to modify their attributes. It can ask the others to give them useful information. And a turtle can directly access certain attributes of the patch it resides on. So it's as if, as it moves through patches, it inherits the attributes of those patches. And so that's the special thing about a patch. So again, it's very much built to model spatial relationships. So you walk on top of patches, so you temporarily inherit their attributes. Then you walk on a new patch, you temporarily inherit their attributes, and so on. And that's kind of the, this asking perspective is going to be the weirdest thing when you look at the code when compared to normal code that you've otherwise seen. And so you'll get experience with that in Lab 4. As you're looking for this in Lab 4, the help in NetLogo is phenomenal. So if there's a procedure that you don't recognize, you don't understand what it's doing, you can right-click on it and say, look up in dictionary, or you can go up to the help here, and they've got a dictionary, again, that look up in dictionary, they've got a user manual, the dictionary, links to a users group for additional help, and so on. The programming guide here, again, it's really well written, it's very comprehensive, it's like a textbook in itself. So for every routine, it gives you the syntax, it gives you a description of what it does, it gives you an example of how it's used, and see also to other things that are related. So it's really useful. They have whole code examples built into the user manual. And as I already mentioned, they're in the models library, there's whole models you can build, but one of the sections of that models library is something called code samples, where they have very tiny little models that aren't full-fledged models. They don't model a phenomena, they just do specific things. Like, how do I want to bounce balls off a wall? Well, there's reflection, snippets of code that are already here. How do I draw boxes? Well, there's box drawing here as well. I didn't mention it, but NetLogo also operates in 3D. There's 3D examples here too. How do I build agents in 3D and so on? So it really comes with everything you need out of the box to get up and running without needing, a textbook. There are some great textbooks that are out there, but it's a great tool to pick up and get moving with. So the basic structure of any one of these programs is up in the preamble, you define all of your agent breeds, you define their attributes. So that's what's going on here, all of my breeds. So this is a simulation of a tree. It's called Autumn, which is actually kind of a neat sim. So I'll go and I'll just show that one here. bring it up here on this. So basically, Autumn simulates the processes that go into the change of colors of leaves. So everything having to do with temperature, water, sunlight, and so on. So if I were to slow that down, you could possibly see, if I go up here and I say I want to run that slower, then for these particulars, I can say how many leaves do I have here? Maybe I want to increase those. You know, how much sugar is in the leaves? What's the temperature outside? How much rain? What's the rain intensity, and so on. And so I've slowed this down significantly so you can see the color change of the leaves, and through you can see rain coming down. And so all of these different forces are acting on these agents representing these leaves, which ultimately lead to a simulation of the process that leads to actually leaves falling at a relatively synchronized time. So that's what this autumn sim is all about. And so that's these snippets that I'm showing here in the lecture are borrowed directly from the Autumn code, which is one of the sample models that is provided for you in NetLogo in the models library. So it's kind of a neat educational tool. So again, every NetLogo program is going to have, like I said, a preamble where you define all of different breeds of agents, the attributes of all the breeds of agents, any global variables, which you can think of as state variables there. From that, there's always there's a setup procedure where the setup procedure is typically associated with the setup button. So that's the one that before it drew the tree, I could set all the sliders, hit setup, and it would draw the tree with all of those. So that is usually only run once at the beginning of your sim. And then there's usually a go procedure, which is usually associated with a go button that has that forever check. So that when you click on the go, it reruns this procedure over and over again. And this actually is what makes time click in your simulation. So it's like one tiny little increment of time, then again and again and again. And so you can run this one by one manually if you're debugging the sim or want to run really slow, or you can just check that forever button on the go button that's associated with this, and then NetLogo will run this over and over again for you. And that's basically it. That's how, you know, all of these run. So I've sort of set up a really simple example that if you were to open up NetLogo and just copy and paste this from the lecture and paste it in, then it would run. So I could do that now. I think I'm gonna hold off on that just for time here, but I can see that I defined attributes for turtles. I have a setup where I create 10 turtles with random headings and random speeds at random positions. And then I ask in my go routine, I ask all the turtles to move forward at their speed. If they run into any other turtles, they basically turn around away from any turtles that they interact with. They set their speed to the minimum speed of themselves and the turtle that they interacted with, and then they keep going. And so it's a relatively simple procedure, but if you were to run that, it has an interesting sort of collective behavior that comes out of that. So that's something that you can take a look of if you like, just by, and that's an entire program in NetLogo that simulates, really, I could have made this 1,000 agents. And so, you know, you can do a lot with very little in NetLogo. So it's kind of a neat language. Other samples that you're going to work with is, so segregation and fire are the two ones you work with in Lab 4. These are other ones that I'm recommend looking at. Traffic grid, Hotelling's law, but really anything under the models library. There's a bunch of different models out there in other sources. So from the NetLogo user community, as well as the modeling commons, I just picked 2 of them. One of them a supply chain model, another one in sort of an artificial financial market. Yeah, so that's basically it. So that's kind of a very brief intro to NetLogo and agent-based modeling. You'll go a little bit more in depth in Lab 4, but I just wanted to at least give you some kind of an idea of how it connects to the rest of the class here, so you can kind of prepare you for what you're going up against in Lab 4. Because Lab 4 is like really your first kind of programming type lab, but it's with this language that's probably unfamiliar. So any questions? about ABM, NetLogo, or Lab 4? Questions online? If not, the last thing that I want to mention today is a quick postmortem on Lab 3. So you did these kind of more static simulations and spreadsheets. So you did this question about determining pi by stochastic simulation. And you basically said, well, if I throw random dots at a square and I inscribe a circle in that square, how many dots fall inside the circle? That's really sort of what the sim was asking. And we know ahead of time that, well, the probability of that should just be the ratio of the areas. So the area of the circle divided by the total area, that's just pi r squared divided by 2r, that's the side of this square, squared, which just becomes pi over 4. So we know it should be a pi over 4 probability that these green dots show up, or the dots inside the circle show up relative to all of the dots. So the idea here is, when I can simplify this and focus on just a quarter of a circle, so if I zoom in, it's basically the same idea. The area of a quarter circle is pi r squared over 4. The area of this square in this corner is just r squared. So again, the probability that I land inside the circle is still pi over 4. So the thought here is, if I just generate random points in a square and ask, so this is what I did in the spreadsheet here, a random x coordinate, a random y coordinate, where my x and y are both between 0 and 1, that's going to generate these random points somewhere in this square. I can, for each one of them, ask, does that xy coordinate fall inside this circle? And if I count all of those up, and I do that enough times, I should get an approximation of this probability. And if I have an approximation of this probability, I have an approximation of pi over 4. If I have an approximation of pi over 4, multiply that by 4, and I have an approximation of pi. So that's all that you basically did inside the lab here, is you counted of the whatever 1,000 rows, how many of them fell within the circle. And I can do that a bunch of different ways. So here I just summed up all the ones in this column here, divided by the total number, and multiply that by 4, and that got me an estimate of pi. So there were any questions about that? Did you guys understand what we were doing in that portion where you were estimating pi and saw how that was happening? You really were just estimating a probability, and geometrically that probability was related to an area of a circle, and an area of a circle involves pi. So that's where we got pi from drawing random numbers. All right, now questions online. If we do that, so you did, I asked you to do it for, I don't know, 500 or 1,000, I forget what I asked in the lab. But I went ahead and did it in an experiment with 500 rows, with 1,000 rows, different rows, 10,000 rows, maybe 10,000 I asked you for in lab, 100,000 and 1,000,000 rows. And so each one of these I ran with totally different numbers. It's not like I added things to it. I didn't do like these 500 rows plus another 500, give me that 1,000. These were a brand new set of rows here. And then on each one of those, I estimated pi, that's the dots in the center of these bars. And then I used, for error bars here, the so-called standard error of the mean. So the idea here is that every time I run 500 sims, I'm going to get a different estimate of pi. So I run 500 rows, I get one number. Say it's 3.05. If I were to rerun that sim with another 500 rows, I might get 3.2. If I were to rerun it again with another 500 rows and estimate pi, I might get 2.9. I could take a distribution of all of those solutions, and this is related to the central limit theorem, that so those solutions would be on a bell curve. And that bell curve would have a particular standard deviation. And so from those 500 rows, I can estimate the likely standard deviation of that bell curve and use it to give me kind of a guess of where most of those estimates might fall. And that's what the standard error of the mean represents. The mean that you calculated in this one experiment plus a standard error away in either direction, which is trying to estimate that if you ran the experiment over and over again, where would likely most of the mass line up. And so we can see here that when you run 500 of these, then this mean plus SEM doesn't actually intersect, at least for this experiment, pi. So it's like this is actually kind of farther away than we would like. And so if I do with 1,000, now I notice the standard error mean shrinks and the whole interval kind of gets, in this particular case, closer to 3.14. And as I keep increasing the number of rows, my standard error of the mean gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it becomes more likely that this interval, the mean plus the standard error, includes the actual population mean, pi. And that's what we're going to, so that kind of idea here is like, this is sort of capturing what happens when you run more replications of an experiment. You reduce the uncertainty in these estimates so that the intervals remaining are likely to include the real population mean. Now, standard error of the mean is somewhat useful for visualization, but it doesn't quite have the rigor of interpretation here. And so that's the reason why we're going to shift in the bottom half of the course to not just presenting means, but doing means and confidence intervals. And so now I've converted those standard error means into 95% confidence intervals. And now I actually have an interpretation of those intervals. It's not kind of qualitative. It actually makes a lot more sense what's going on here. What a 95% confidence interval is, and we'll learn how to convert standard error to confidence intervals, is what we're saying is that 95% of the time I run any of these experiments, 500, 1,000, or whatever, 95% of the time, the confidence interval should include the population mean, should include pi. So not surprisingly, across all of my experimental designs, 500, 1,000, 10,000, 100, and a million, all of them include pi. If I kept running them, eventually I would get, even up here at 1 million, eventually one of these confidence intervals that were generated would not include pi. But it would only happen 5% of the time. 95% of the time I run the experiment, my estimator, my interval estimator, includes the population mean. And this is the reason why, towards the end of the semester, none of you should be giving me single mean estimates. Whenever you run a sim, you should be giving me confidence intervals. Because every time you run the sim, you run the sim once, it might be 3.05. If you run the sim another time, it might be 3.17. So the idea here is, point estimates are meaningless, pun intended, that we want one number, but because we can run a sim over and over again, we can get different point estimates. So we don't want to give a point estimate, we want to give an interval estimate. And this is the reason why, you see plus or minuses, like whenever somebody says, oh, we think that the actual unemployment rate is 8% plus or minus 0.5%. Well, they don't actually know. They've estimated what they think the unemployment rate is based on the small sample, and they don't want to give you one number. They want to say that the actual unemployment rate is somewhere in this interval. That's what a confidence interval is. And that's the reason why, beautifully here, all 5 of these confidence intervals include the true mean of 3.14159. So, and that really shows that off there. So it would be rare that the true mean is in there. So none of these means are a good estimate of pi in some sense, because they're all off. But all of these intervals include pi. So the intervals are so much better than the point estimates. That's why if you give me the interval estimate, you'll be right 95% of the time. If you give me the point estimate, you'll be wrong 100% of the time. Does that make sense? So that's what we're trying to move towards here. And that's the reason why when you start running things in Arena next week with Lab 5, you'll notice the reports all give you half widths, 95% or 95% confidence interval half widths. It's giving you these intervals because, again, if you report an interval, you'll be right 95% of the time. If you report a point, a mean, you'll be wrong 100% of the time. So don't report means. Questions about that? Does that make sense? Does this graph make sense, what I'm showing here? Questions online about this? Okay. All right. So otherwise, the practical lesson that I want you to take from that part of the lab is that if you're using Excel, if you need a random number between 0 and 1, rand is the thing that'll do it for you. So it's an important tool to have. Okay, the other activity you did in the lab that I just want to do a quick overview of here is this stochastic activity network, where we combined the 3-part activity, the 2-part activity, and the 1-part activity in parallel, and asked what is the average duration of the combination and how often does each activity take the longest. So you built a spreadsheet where you basically had a depending on how you could build this in different ways, but I could have 3 columns here represent the 3 different parallel activities. The 3-part duration is going to be the average of 3 random numbers. The 2-part duration, sorry, not the average, the sum of 3 random numbers. The 2-part is going to be the sum of 2 random numbers, and the 1 part is just going to be 1 random number. I can take the max of that, and then I can see which one of those equal the max. And so I provided some code here of one way to do that. And then I can take a distribution of the total times here. And then I can also take a distribution of how often each one of these paths was the path that took the longest. And there's a bunch of tools that you could use to do those things, like the histogram tool in Excel, frequency, average, countif, etc. And when I do that, then I should see something that looks like this, where this is my histogram of durations. And even though all 3 paths had an average time of 9, the combination of them had an average time of something around like 10. Now, I should have put a confidence interval around that, because you're going to say that, well, when I ran it, my average was 10.1. Somebody else would say my average was 10.7, and I ran it as 10.2, which is that every time we run this sim, the average duration was something different. Now, if I gave an interval, then there's a good chance that your points would be in my interval. And more importantly, the real average would be in all our intervals. But I didn't, so because we're not quite there yet. But you can see this distribution, most of the mass is well above 9, even though the average in each individual path was 9, which I think is pretty interesting. And if I look at the critical path distribution, you might have expected that which one took the longest is going to be a 33% chance across all 3. But in reality, by far, the 3rd path, the one that was just a single random variable, it took the longest most of the time. After that, the one that was 2 random variables, and after that, the one that was 3 random variables. So the more random variables we added together, even though they had the same average, actually took the shortest amount of time. And I kind of, and if I add, so this was with 500 samples, if I instead do the experiment with 1,000, then this gets even sharper. And if I do this with 10,000, then I can see that it's not just a freak accident when I ran this one experiment. If I run more and more rows here, then it becomes pretty darn clear that this is a real distribution and this is a real distribution. So I talked about this last time a bit, and hopefully you got to see this as well when you were playing with this yourself, is that the path 1 durations were a sum of 3 random variables. If I were to histogram their durations separately, it looks like a bell curve, almost like a normal distribution. If I histogram the path 2 durations, which are the sum of 2 random variables, it looks like a triangular distribution. And then if I look at the 3rd one, of course, because the 3rd one is a uniform distribution, it comes out uniform. And this triangular distribution is the convolution of 2 uniforms. And so if you convolve 2 boxcars together, you get a triangle. Well, it turns out if you add 2 independent random numbers together, the way you get their distribution out is by convolving the distributions of the 2 things that you add together. So it's no surprise that I go from box to triangle, and you keep convolving. And it turns out that if you keep convolving distributions, you end up independent distributions, then you end up with something that looks like a bell curve. In fact, the limiting distribution is a normal distribution. And that's the central limit theorem. So because we're adding in the top row, but we're not in the bottom, then that means the bottom row is much more likely to have long times than the top. And that's the reason why this distribution is like it is. It's the reason why this whole thing is skewed, so that both of these paths are often waiting on this path. So regardless of how quickly this one is, this one might have been lucky enough to take only 7 minutes, but that doesn't mean this one's also going to be take 7 minutes. This one might have taken a little bit longer, but even if this one took only a little bit longer than 9, there's a good chance this one took even longer. So it's more likely that this one is going to keep everyone waiting, and that's the reason why we get this shift where everything's above 9, even though the average of each is 9. So I think it's a nice example where we can't just look at averages. And so that's kind of my message here. We can't report averages, we have to report intervals, and we can't just look at averages and stats, we have to look at distributions. So distributions matter and interval estimates matter. That's kind of a big thing to take out of this class. All right, so kind of a practical thing here that, I guess before I just mentioned that, are there any questions about this result? Okay, questions online? All right, so practical thing to take out of this, how do you generate a uniform distribution between any number and any other greater number? If you have rand inside Excel, you can multiply rand by the range, by the distance, sort of the gap, and then you can shift it up by the low number, and that gives you a nice formula where you can generate a uniform distribution between A and B. More generally, when we look at this, what we're actually doing is we're converting one type of randomness into another. So we started with random numbers between 0 and 1, and with a little bit of math, we turned it into random numbers between A and B for arbitrary A and B with B greater than A. And that is going to be a major part of what goes on in our stochastic simulations, because we're often not going to need a random number between 0 and 1. We're going to need an exponential or something like that. Well, how do we generate exponentials? Well, we're going to learn how to write these expressions for arbitrary distributions, all that take the 0, 1 as an input. So that's kind of one of the practical lessons here. The other thing that you didn't get a chance to play with as much but that we did talk about in the lab is how to generate discrete random variables. So if I give you 3 discrete outcomes with 3 probabilities, then the idea here is that if I draw a random number from 0 to 1, then I can map intervals of outcomes from that random number to these probabilities. So I need to generate outcome 1 20% of the time. Well, I know that I'm going to get a number between 0 and 0.2 from rand in Excel 20% of the time. I know that I'm going to generate a number less than 0.7 from rand in Excel 70% of the time. So in between 0.7 and 0.2, that's going to happen 50% of the time. So I can chop up the continuum from 0 to 1 and end up associating probabilities to each one of my discrete outcomes. And that's exactly what we do, is we end up, again, setting up these intervals so that we have 3 intervals that correspond to 3 probabilities. And the way we do that systematically is with the cumulative distribution. And that's why in your book, whenever they need to generate discrete random variables, they're going to also have a cumulative. And so we're going to talk about what the cumulative is, but it's basically just, you take 0.2, these two match, you add 0.5 to 0.2 to get 0.7, you add 0.3 to 0.7 to get 1, and that's your cumulative distribution. And so we can now use the cumulative, we can draw a random number between 0 and 1 and see where it lands in the cumulative distribution. And that naturally gives us a mapping between a randomly distributed number between 0 and 1 and 3 discrete outcomes with the appropriate probabilities. So I can draw that, so this is how I'd implement that. I think I can draw it graphically here. I don't have a graphical, but the idea here again is I draw a number, I see what range it falls into, and that gives me my number of outcomes. And that is generally called the inverse transform technique. And in lectures E1 and E2, we're going to figure out how to extend that from discrete random numbers to continuous random numbers, and it involves a little bit of calculus. So that's why in homework D2, which has been released today, you're going to have to do a little bit of integration, a little bit of algebra, because I'm preparing you for us doing the inverse transform technique, which is how we generate any distribution from the uniform distribution from 0 to 1. And that's kind of what we're setting up here. All right, so that's pretty much all I've got for you. I've got to do the postmortem on lab 3, the pre-lab for lab 4, and the intro to ABM. So any questions about any of that? Questions online? If not, here's your attendance opportunity. So I'm just going to put this into the chat as well. If I can, again, just find the mouse. So the question today is when, if you can remember this, if you can't, that's fine. I'm just sort of seeing where this comes, but when you convolve two uniform distributions together, what is the distribution that results? So in other words, what's the shape of a distribution when you have a sum of two uniforms together? So it's the shape of that middle pathway. If you don't get it right, that's fine. I'm just looking for coherence. But if you get it right, that's great. Then I can look through and see how many people are paying attention. Yeah.
It looks like this will go for the next round and the second class lecture because my response and
you can try to just hit submit, and then that'll be, and then I'll see that, and then submit again. So you submit and refresh. And that's all I've got for you today. So otherwise, I'll see you Thursday. Enjoy Lab 4 and NetLogo. Any other questions? Feel free to come up. Any other questions online? If not, then I will go ahead and end the room. Have a good day.